To recap, we began with that man there on the left, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, who in 1932 declared himself king after wresting control of the country from the Sharif of Mecca and his son, formerly supported by the British, now defeated by Abdul Aziz ibn Saud and his fanatical Ikhwan warriors, adherents to Wahhabi Islam. We're going to come back to this when we talk about September 11th. But we then saw how this family's wealth was based entirely, in no uncertain terms, on oil, on Aramco, formerly an American exercise in exploitation of the Third World. Aramco is now wholly owned and operated by the Saudi royal family, who number more than 10,000 people today, all descended from the man on the left of the screen, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud. Today we're going to talk about what it's like to live in Saudi Arabia today. On the one hand, what it is like to be a wealthy young Saudi with millions and millions of petrodollars in the bank, what it's like to be a man, and the very different experience of being a woman. And then we're going to end by talking about something that Saudis don't like to talk about themselves and would prefer that we didn't talk about, to be completely honest, and that is the situation of non-native workers in the country, imported labor, many of whom toil in conditions not unlike slavery. The people who built the country are not Saudis. They come from Sri Lanka, they come from other Arab Gulf states, they come from Indonesia, they come from India, they come from Africa. They built the country, and they maintain the country today. Very few actual Saudi male citizens work, in our conception of the term. So let's see what it's like to grow up Saudi. First, let's talk about the geography of the country. It is a desert, in absolutely no uncertain terms. Roughly 20% of the size of the continental United States, the map of the United States here, the topographical map, and the topographical map of Saudi Arabia are on the same scale, so you can get a sense of the size of the country, although 98.3% of that is essentially desert. Only 1.7% of the land is actually arable, and only 0.09% of the land is actually in agricultural use, making them number 216 out of 241 countries in the world in terms of food production. Saudi Arabia is an agricultural monoculture, and what they grow is oil. You can see here this graph from 1976 to 2016. On the one hand, spike in native food production and the subsequent depletion of that native food stock, forcing them to import ever larger proportions of their food from abroad. This may not seem like a big deal, but oil is not going to last forever. Does it have 20 years? Does it have 50 years? Does it have 15 years? Whatever the case, when Saudi Arabia runs out of oil, it'll be a very different place indeed. A very arid and dry place. Demographically speaking, there are 25 million people living in the country today. In terms of the sex ratio, male to female, I find something very, very interesting indeed. 1.19 men per women. I should say there's 1.19 man for every woman, meaning there are 4 women for every 5 men in the country. That may not seem like an odd statistic when you first look at it, but if you look at the United States, 0.97 men per woman, in other words, there are more women than men in this country. The world average is 1.01, in other words, 50-50. China, 1.06, in no small part because of the restrictions on childbirth and the number of children you can have, and the preference for boys. Deep dark secret of China is there is a not inconsequential amount of female infanticide going on in that country. 1.19 men for every woman. This is in line with the Gulf states, Oman, Bahrain, Kuwait. All these countries are very similar in terms of their social makeup, in terms of their religiosity, in terms of their extremely conservative social mores, and all have many more men than women. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that is? Well, there's two possible explanations. One is that boys are prized. After all, we know that Mohammed bin Laden, father of Osama bin Laden, had 54 sons. We have no idea how many daughters he had. And we know that Abdulaziz ibn Saud had 45 sons, but we have no idea how many daughters he had. So one possible explanation is female infanticide, selective abortion, selective infanticide. Now that's a pretty harsh conclusion. Another possible conclusion is because of the huge number of non-native laborers in the country, that you have simply more female laborers being brought in than male laborers, mainly for domestic service, or, let's be honest here, possibly for the sex trade. It's definitely not a Muslim thing, because if we look here, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, Yemen, Iraq, Iran, all within close proximity to the world average. Not quite, but it's not 1.19, it's not 1.23, or not the 1.53 of Kuwait. All this is to say, and what the point of this is, that there is no equality between the sexes in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, in the Gulf states, in the Muslim world in general, but especially here in Arabia. Women are actually, I would say, less than second-class citizens. Let's look at the reasons why that is, and what the effect of that is on the ground. Separate and unequal. That's what we have in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, in Kuwait, Oman, etc. Literacy rates. 85% of men can read, 70% of women can read. That is because, as we've already seen, prior to King Faisal, in the 1960s and early 1970s, women were not allowed to be educated at all. And so the female literacy rate in, let's say, 1950 was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 10%. So it is 70% now, but that obviously shows a gulf between the life experience and what you can expect out of life if you're a man versus if you're a woman. Of course, in these two pictures we see the differing standards of dress. Women are expected to be dressed extraordinarily conservatively. You can show your face. This woman has chosen not to. You can, but it would be better if you didn't. We're going to come back to this subject when we talk about the religious police in Saudi Arabia, the Mutaween. So the literacy rates are obviously unequal. Let's take a look at the educational system in depth to see why that might be.